carrying a question that echoes through the corridors of every healing space, every therapeutic encounter, every moment when someone who has given everything suddenly withdraws. Why does the empath, once nurturing and endlessly available, become so formidable when they cease to care? But I must correct your perception from the beginning. They do not become dangerous because they have transformed into something malevolent. They become dangerous because they have finally revealed what was always there. Their authentic power, no longer masked by compulsive giving. The danger lies not in their cruelty, but in their clarity. The empath who stops caring has not betrayed their nature. They have stopped betraying themselves. For decades, perhaps generations, they have embodied what Jung called the wounded healer archetype, walking through life as emotional first responders, believing their sensitivity was their calling. But what they failed to understand, what no one taught them, is that unguarded openness becomes psychic invasion, and unchecked absorption transforms into spiritual possession. Yes, possession. The empath who has not yet individuated becomes a vessel for others' unprocessed emotions. They do not merely empathize, they become contaminated. They digest grief that belongs to others, metabolize rage that was never theirs to carry, and shoulder shame not because of their own transgressions, but because they stood too close to those who refused to face their own shadows. The awakening within. But every archetype contains its opposite, its complementary force. The empath is not only the perpetual giver, they are also the keeper of truth. And when the balance shifts, when their giving becomes compulsion rather than choice, something primordial stirs within them. This awakening never announces itself quietly. It begins in the realm of dreams, visions of breaking chains, of wild animals emerging from sacred temples, of floods washing away carefully constructed facades. These nocturnal messages are not random imagery. They are communications from the unconscious, signaling that the psyche's equilibrium has been shattered. The anima, the soul image within, has been distorted through repeated self-abandonment. What emerges is not the dream of continued service, but the vision of reckoning. When the empath stops caring the old way, society labels it cruelty. But I tell you, it is the first breath of their liberation. It is not indifference. It is discernment. Not coldness, but consciousness. They are not discarding their compassion. They are rescuing it from misappropriation. The empath who ceases to care compulsively does not stop loving. They simply begin to love in alignment with their own soul's truth. For too long, they have been seduced by the martyr archetype, believing that self-sacrifice represents the highest virtue, that suffering for others constitutes holiness. But even the great spiritual teachers understood boundaries. Even the most compassionate beings knew when to withdraw, when to preserve their essence for the work that truly mattered. There comes a moment when the empath must choose the path of the warrior, not to battle others, but to confront the internalized voices that whispered, "Your worth depends on your usefulness to others." They must learn to say no without justification, to choose themselves without apology, to love without losing themselves in the process. Consider the ancient symbol of the Ouroboros, the serpent consuming its own tail. This is not an image of destruction, but of transformation, of devouring one's false self to birth authenticity. The empath who stops caring enacts this sacred right. They consume the compliant self, the one who nodded while bleeding internally, who forgave without being asked, who carried burdens that were never theirs to bear. This metamorphosis disturbs others and frightens the empath themselves. The world that once benefited from their boundaryless giving begins to recoil from their newfound strength. Relationships built on imbalance begin to crumble. They are accused of changing, and indeed they have. But this change is not born of malice. It is resurrection. The shift to sovereignty.
Let us delve deeper into the psychological mechanics at work. The empath's journey, when unconscious, is governed by what Jung termed the mother complex, regardless of biological gender. This complex, when unresolved, manifests as compulsive caretaking. Even unto self-destruction, it whispers seductive lies. Your value lies in being needed. Your worth is measured by your service. Solitude is selfishness. But in truth, the empath has confused enmeshment with intimacy, codependence with connection. When they stop caring in the way the complex demands, they are not abandoning love. They are redefining it. They are declaring, I will not carry what does not belong to me. I will not sacrifice my lie to fuel your avoidance of growth. I will love you, but I will not bleed for you.
This is not cruelty. This is sovereignty. The most dangerous empath is one who has made the descent into their own underworld and returned not with bitterness, but with vision. They are no longer accessible in the ways that narcissists require and energy vampires demand. They become a mirror, and what others see reflected is not flattery, but truth. This is what makes them truly dangerous. Not because they harm, but because they reveal. Most people exist within carefully constructed illusions, and the empath who still cares compulsively is easily woven into these deceptions. They become the emotional repository, the perpetual mediator, the silent absorber of others' dysfunction. But the awakened empath, the one who has stopped caring indiscriminately, becomes a threat to collective delusion. They ask uncomfortable questions. Why am I expected to sacrifice my peace for your comfort? Why is your emotional regulation my responsibility? Why must I diminish myself to maintain your illusion of wholeness? And suddenly, the spell is broken. Let me share with you the myth of Persephone, who descended into the underworld and emerged transformed. Like Persephone, the empath must strip away their false identities. The eternal giver, the selfless healer, the boundaryless saint. They must face the dark goddess within, the aspect that rages at injustice, that mourns their own abandonment, that hungers for reciprocity and respect. When they stop caring in the old way, they are not becoming cold. They are stepping into sacred descent. And when they return, they are irrevocably changed. They have integrated their shadow, and this integration makes them whole. Wholeness in a world addicted to fragments is the most revolutionary force imaginable. The crucible of transformation. But we must speak of the crucible, for the empath who has stopped caring in the familiar way is not yet free. They exist in a liminal space between who they were and who they are becoming, between the false self and the authentic self. This is what alchemists called the negrado, the blackening, the death that precedes rebirth. In this darkness, the empath encounters their most terrifying discovery. They too are capable of anger, resentment, pride, even contempt. These are emotions they have long condemned in others and denied within themselves. Throughout their lives, they were taught that such feelings were incompatible with love, so they buried them deep. But now these shadows rise. Do not fear this emergence. Welcome it, for here begins the true work. The shadow is not the enemy. It is the guardian of authenticity. When the empath acknowledges a suppressed anger, not to project it outward, but to integrate it, they reclaim their psychic wholeness. They no longer split themselves into acceptable and unacceptable parts. They become a complete. And completeness, true embodied wholeness, is what the unconscious seeks above all else. But the world does not know how to respond to a whole person. It knows how to interact with roles, masks, personas. It knows how to reward conformity to unconscious agreements. The empath who stops caring in the conditioned way refuses to play their assigned role. They disrupt the system. They no longer apologize for their truth. They no longer minimize themselves to keep others comfortable. This makes them dangerous, not destructive, but transformative. Let us explore the architecture of the psyche more deeply. The empath often operates from a dominant feeling function, highly attuned to the emotional atmosphere around them. But when undeveloped, this function becomes over-identification with others' experiences. The undeveloped feeling type becomes consumed by the needs, moods, and projections of their environment. But when individuated, when the empath has journeyed through their own underworld and returned, they begin to develop their inferior functions. They ground themselves in thinking, in intuition, in bodily sensation. They learn discernment. They learn to inhabit their own body again. They no longer use empathy as a defense mechanism or bargaining chip. They wield it as a conscious choice, guided by wisdom. Now they can say, "I feel your pain, but I will not carry it." They can declare, "I see your wound, but I will not make healing it my mission when you refuse to face it yourself." This is the sword of truth. When an empath wields it, they become luminous. The archetype shifts once more. The wounded healer becomes the sovereign, no longer defined by others' suffering, but rooted in their own center. They no longer seek validation through sacrifice. They no longer confuse exhaustion with virtue. They become aligned, and alignment is power, not dominance, but radiance. This radiance unsettles the unconscious. Others begin to project. "You've become arrogant," they say. "You've changed." And they are correct, but not in the way they believe. What they perceive as arrogance is actually self-respect. What they witness is not betrayal, but return. The empath has returned to their own soul. There is a reason why many empaths, once awakened, found themselves walking alone for a time. This is the exile before re-emergence, the wilderness after bondage, and before the promised land. It is the necessary solitude of metamorphosis. Do not resist this phase. In this solitude, the empath encounters the self, not the ego, not the persona, but the totality of their being, conscious and unconscious united. In this meeting, they receive their next instruction. They were not meant to be consumed by the world, but to transform it. This is the true danger they pose, not to individuals, but to unconscious systems that thrive on dependency, distortion, and emotional manipulation. The awakened empath refuses to feed these systems. They will not be the emotional sponge, the perpetual rescuer, the silent sufferer. They become sovereign. They become creative force, the gift of presence. Let me offer you a final image for this portion of our exploration. In many myths, the hero returns from the underworld, bearing a gift for humanity. The empath too brings a gift, but it is not what others expect. It is not endless accommodation or boundaryless understanding. The gift is presence, pure, undistorted, radiant presence. A presence that sees clearly, that listens beyond words, that holds space without being consumed by it. This presence awakens others not through force, but through reflection. In this reflection, others are invited to confront their own shadows, to integrate their own souls. And that, my friends, is the most dangerous act of all. To awaken one person is to challenge 1,000 illusions. When the empath begins to embody this radiant presence, something profound occurs not only within them, but in the field around them. The psyche extends beyond the boundaries of individual skin. What you feel, what you repress, what you embody, all of this reverberates outward into the collective field. The fully integrated empath becomes a living mirror, and mirrors are not always welcome. Why? Because to stand before a clear mirror means confronting ourselves, not our idealized self, not our polished persona, but the raw, undigested shadow we have exiled into the unconscious. The awakened empath reflects this shadow without uttering a word. This is why people recoil, why they accuse, why some attempt to diminish or destroy what they cannot understand. It is not hatred, it is fear. In the presence of someone who no longer needs approval, who no longer trades peace for affection, illusions can no longer survive. Here we encounter the archetype of the alchemical vessel, the hermetically sealed container. The empath, once open and absorbing everything, now becomes contained, held, centered. They are no longer leaking energy in every direction. They no longer fragment themselves to avoid conflict. They become the vessel that can endure the heat of transformation. They hold paradox, truth, and complexity within themselves. Through this containment, they become not only healed, but healing. But beware this misunderstanding. The empath does not become detached. They become differentiated. This is a crucial distinction. Detachment implies numbing. Differentiation implies clarity. The empath still feels, still connects, still loves, but no longer at the cost of their essence. This is what makes them magnetic. They draw others not through desperation, but through sovereignty. Those who come are those ready to see, to grow, to be accountable.
The empath has become a filter, unconsciously repelling what is false, unconsciously attracting what is real. This is the beginning of what I call the sacred circle, a soul-aligned constellation of relationships no longer driven by need, but guided by resonance.
The sacred fire of discernment. You ask if there is danger of arrogance when the empath reclaims such power. Yes, there is always risk when power is reclaimed after long repression. The ego, tasting freedom, may confuse it with superiority. The newly awakened empath may, for a time, mistake boundaries for walls, clarity for judgment, solitude for withdrawal. This is natural, part of the pendulum's swing, they have been submerged so long in others' needs that when they finally surface, they may gasp with the hunger of the long drowned. Do not shame this phase, guide it. The goal is not to remain in resistance, but to evolve into discernment. Not to say I no longer care, but to declare I now care differently, wisely from the soul, rather than from the wound. This shift changes everything. When care flows from the soul, it heals. When it flows from the wound, it perpetuates dysfunction. The empath who stops caring in the wounded way must learn to care in the awakened way, to give not to be loved, but because they are love, to speak truth not to dominate, but to liberate, to walk away not to punish, but to protect what is sacred within. Here we reach the image of the sacred marriage within the psyche, the hieros gamos. The inner masculine and feminine, once at war, begin to dance. The feminine, empathic, receptive, intuitive, no longer dominates. The masculine, discerning, asserting, defining, no longer remains dormant. They unite. The empath becomes both soft and strong, yielding and rooted, open and defined. Such integration cannot be manipulated. It cannot be shamed into compliance or flattered into servitude. It cannot be seduced by promises of belonging, because it belongs to itself. Such self-possession is rare. It disturbs the collective unconscious because it reminds us all of what we have forfeited in our quest for acceptance. The awakened empath becomes a portal through which others glimpse their own potential. That glimpse either inspires transformation or provokes attack. The empaths must be prepared for both responses. They must not personalize rejection or take attacks personally. They must understand that the resistance is not against them personally, but against what they mirror. The possibility of authentic selfhood. You may notice that at this stage, the empath begins to speak differently, not louder, but with gravity. Each word carries weight. They no longer explain themselves endlessly or over-apologize. They no longer seek understanding from those committed to misunderstanding them. Their silence becomes dangerous too, because the empath's silence is not withdrawal, it is containment. Contained energy is potent in a world of endless noise. The one who does not react but simply holds immense power. Their presence disrupts dysfunction. Their boundaries expose imbalance. Their choices reflect truth. And truth, unfiltered, unapologetic truth, is what the world fears most. Let me share a dream that illustrates this transformation. A woman told me she dreamed of standing at the edge of a great chasm. Across it stood all those she had once served, once loved, once given herself to completely. They beckoned, "Come back, you've changed." She looked down into the chasm, dark, terrifying, but from the depths, her own voice rose, not external but within. To return to them is to lose yourself again. Cross not toward them, but toward yourself. And so she stepped into the void, not away from them, but toward her soul. This willingness to choose oneself, not in narcissism, but in sacred reclamation, in psychic sovereignty, this is the danger the empath now embodies. The archetype of the destroyer. There is something I must now speak of with deepest reverence. The empath's ultimate encounter, not with the outer world, but with the archetype of the destroyer within. Yes, the destroyer, not as evil or malice, but as sacred force. After the empath stops caring compulsively and tastes the edges of self-reclamation, a new instinct arises from the psychic depths, the need to burn away all that was never truly theirs. This instinct is holy. It is psychic fire that severs enmeshment, cuts ancestral cords of martyrdom, burns false loyalties. It confronts the lies they've told themselves for years. If I don't give everything, I am nothing. If I stop caring, I become like those who hurt me. But now they realize that not caring in the old way is not loss of love. It is birth of discernment. Discernment is not cold. It is sacred fire. That fire begins to move through him, and here the archetype of Kaylee, the fierce goddess of death and rebirth, arises in the psyche. Her dance is not against love, but for liberation. The empath embodying this phase may suddenly end relationships, walk away from long-held roles, dismantle identities that no longer serve. This is the storm before integration. Others may call them dangerous, and they are, but only to illusion. Only to dependency structures that once fed on their silence. In this moment, the empath learns the art of spiritual non-cooperation. They stop feeding dysfunction with kindness. They stop confusing compassion with self-erasure. As they embody this fire, something paradoxical happens. The softness returns, but now rooted in truth. No longer the softness of compliance, but the softness of presence. Compassion that sees clearly, feels deeply, but no longer abandons itself to save what cannot yet be saved. Now the empath begins to feel a new emotion, strange and unfamiliar at first. Peace. Not because the world has changed, but because they have ceased trying to hold it all together. This peace signals to the unconscious. I am no longer available for roles that diminish me. Peace in this sense is not lack of conflict. It is refusal to be at war with oneself. At this stage, something ancient stirs in the psychic depths. The empath reconnects with the archetype of the sage, one who speaks little but sees much, who no longer defines themselves by service or suffering, but by inner alignment. Here is the paradox that breaks open the final gate. The empath, now whole, begins to feel others more than ever. But this time, they do not carry those feelings. They witness them. This witnessing is transmutation. It is the difference between drowning in the ocean and standing calmly on the shore, listening to its tides, knowing when to step in and when to remain still. The empath no longer asks, "What do you need from me?" They ask, "What is true in this moment?" From that truth, their actions arise not from guilt or pressure, but from deep inner movement. Now the world sees them and does not know what to make of them. They are still loving, but no longer needed in the way they once were. Their present no longer fills others' wounds, it calls others to face them. In a world that thrives on unconscious transactions, I give so you'll stay. I shrink so you'll feel big. The empath offered something radically different. Truth without condition, without bargaining, without apology. This truth radiates in silence, in boundaries, in a smile that seeks no approval. It is not cruel. It is sacred alignment, inviting others, not all, but the ready, to rise as well. This final transformation is not dramatic. It is quiet, so quiet that many may not notice it happening, but you will feel the shift in your body. Where once there was contraction, there is now breath. Where once there was guilt, there is now knowing.
Where once there was fear, there is now clarity.
In this clarity you become unshakable, not rigid, not armored, but centered. You become, as the mystics say, the still point in the turning world, not because the world stops spinning, but because you no longer try to spin with it just to belong. You belong now to yourself. In that belonging you become a refuge, not because you absorb others, but because you embody what they seek: presence, depth, truth. The empath who stops caring in the old way becomes, paradoxically, the only one truly capable of caring in the new way, a care born not of need but of essence, the psychic sovereign. What happens when the empath no longer performs, when they stop playing the role society rehearsed them into, when they release the duty of emotional labor not from bitterness, but from initiation? They become what I call the psychic sovereign, not ruling over others, but no longer ruled from within by unexamined shadow, compulsive empathy, or inherited scripts of goodness. They walk with the grace of someone who has met the underworld and did not ask to be rescued. This inner sovereignty does not broadcast itself. It hums like ancient music through the body, shapes their posture, their gaze, their presence. They no longer explain their number. They no longer betray their yes. They live in accordance, and in that state, so rare, so luminous, others feel both drawn and undone. For the unhealed do not always crave healing. Often they crave continuation of familiar pain. They seek someone to echo their dysfunction, not disrupt it. The sovereign empath does not echo, they mirror. And mirrors are sacred but often hated. They reveal too much. This is why many who once relied on the empath will retreat or attack once the caring ceases to be performative and becomes aligned. You're selfish, they may say. You've changed, and they are right. The empath has shifted from unconscious martyr to conscious mystic, from emotional sponge to embodied soul. One told me a dream. He saw himself carrying dozens of wounded animals through a burning forest, his arms bleeding, his lungs choking. When he reached the edge, he collapsed, and the animals vanished, whole of them. He woke weeping, not for the animals, but for all the years spent rescuing what never truly needed saving. This is the crux. The empath must learn the difference between presence and interference, between compassion and codependence, between soul invitation and trauma-bonded obligation. When they stop caring in the old way, they are reclaiming discernment. And discernment is the highest form of love, for it says, I will not lie to you. I will not enable your illusion. I will not carry your wound so you can avoid it, but I will stand here in truth, in soul, in clarity. And if you choose to rise, I will witness your becoming. That witnessing is holy. It requires nothing, and in that nothingness, it births everything. The empath, once healed and sovereign, does not isolate. They re-enter the collective, not to perform or rescue, but to anchor, to offer frequency. They become the rare soul whose silence awakens, whose presence unsettles without harm, whose gaze restores dignity simply by being whole. Others feel this field. Some are drawn and change, some resist and project, some flee entirely. This is not the empath's burden. This is the sacred alchemy of presence. They are no longer doing care. They are care. And this care is no longer flavored by guilt, fear, or identity. It is flavored by being. And being, as I have long taught, is the true self breaking through the rubble of persona. So I tell you now, if you are an empath who has stopped caring, you are not broken. You are not cold. You are not lost. You are awakening. You are shedding roles, scripts, masks, illusions. You are walking the razor's edge between feeling and knowing. You are unlearning the lie that love means self-abandonment. You are coming home. When you arrive, truly arrive, you will realize you were never meant to carry it all. You were meant to see it, feel it, and return it to its rightful place. You were meant to hold presence like a flame, steady, illuminating, not consuming. You were meant to become dangerous, not to the world, but to the unconscious patterns that enslave it. So walk gently now, but do not dim. Let your no echo like thunder when needed. Let your yes bloom like spring when true. Let your silence become your song. Let your love become your boundary. Remember, the most dangerous empath is one who no longer needs to be needed. They are no longer food for the broken. They are the invitation to wholeness. And in that invitation, the world